You're listening to Big World Network.
Bedlam, Episode 1. Written by Riley Amos Westbrook and Sarah Lynn Westbrook. Read by Ton Krakowski. Gladys surveyed the room around her, twitchy with pent-up energy she could no longer spend. The blue walls filled her with a somber feeling, one she couldn't shake off. The smell of bodies that had been closed in for far too long soured the air. She could see her grandson across the room, discussing something with one of the other patients. He was a sweet young man, but troubled since his mother and father had divorced. A sharp twinge shot down her spine, drawing her thoughts away from family, and she twisted in her seat to try and gain a measure of comfort. The pain left her with a pervading ache in her bones, one she hadn't been able to escape for years. She couldn't help but think back on her younger days, dancing and singing with her husband and children. The thought brought a smile to her face, before reality came crashing down. Now she was a shell of her former self. She longed to dance the jitterbug with her husband on this green linoleum. They'd show these nurses a thing or two, by golly. They may still be young and beautiful, but she and Harold were a sight on the dance floor. She missed her gallant and kind husband, the only man she knew that could tame her. Tall and handsome, it had broken her when he died. The cough of a nearby patient brought her back from her little dream world. The oxygen mask that covered her face left her with a claustrophobic feeling. It was one she struggled against every second of every day as she waited for death to come and claim her. Always she could feel his skeletal presence just behind her, waiting. The mask sucked against her face as she breathed in, and formed a loose seal on her nose and mouth as she breathed out. The oxygen was being forced into her. The doctors had finally written a prescription to be enforced if she refused to wear it. They said her O2 stats dropped too low, whatever that meant. As time passed, she'd grown so dependent on her tanks that she was never able to remove the mask for more than a few minutes at a time. That, combined with her COPD and skin cancer, conspired to leave her ragged and stuck where she was. Now death was knocking at the door, waiting to take her. When and where he wished to take her, she didn't know. At least she didn't have it as bad as Thelma. That poor woman had a hole in her throat from a tracheotomy, and she still couldn't quit smoking. Obese, her head shaved, filled with cruel thoughts towards herself, and her teeth half rotten from years of drugs and living on the cold streets. Gladys would never understand why people chose to lower themselves so. Still, she couldn't deny she longed for the sweet taste of a cancer stick on one of her last days, and settled deeper into her chair. Thelma snorted awake, coughing out a disgusting ball of phlegm from her breathing hole. Green and black ooze leaked from the hole in her throat, dripping slowly towards the ground in a long, slimy string. She pressed the call button next to her on the bed rail, hoping one of the nurses was awake. Sometimes they forgot they were here to do a job and fell asleep during the long nights. She watched a trail of ants make a slow march through her room, looking for the leftover candy bar she had on her desk. She would have slapped at them angrily if she weren't choking. A tall, intimidating man approached the door, rolling his eyes as he stepped into the room and flicked the light on. The ants disappeared, leaving only the empty wrapper of her candy bar behind. The orderly acted as if she had interrupted him. This burly-looking man had always reminded her of her father, bald and strong like an ox. His shoulders were broad, and his nose was crooked from being broken on more than one occasion. She would hear him brag to the nurses behind the station on a daily basis, trying to get a piece of tail without needing to go to the bar. From what she could tell, they were all immune to his charms, or thought he was a creep. She could understand that. Thelma always felt as if he were sizing her up, ready to do things to her. Thelma pointed to her throat, and the man nodded. She felt the mucus slide down her throat as she tried to suck in a breath, feeling light-headed from the lack of air. He left the room, returning a moment later with a few rags for her to clean up. "I let the nurse know. She'll be here in a moment to clean it out for you." She wiped at her throat, then tried to push the mucus out with an exhale. It did nothing, though. The slimy stuff just bubbled and sputtered, a tiny bit leaking from the hole. Thelma always hated the start to her days now. She felt phlegm slide down her throat, threatening to choke her as she attempted to wheeze another breath into her lungs. She used to love the mornings, before it became such a hassle just to leave her room. Now every day she struggled to even take a breath, and needed the nurse's help in order to clean out the hole that let her breathe. Phlegm blocked her only access to oxygen, and she felt as if she were drowning on her own sputum. The instrument the woman brought in was menacing. A long, clear plastic wand attached to a vacuum-type contraption. "We'll have this done in no time, sweetie. You just relax." The nurse turned on the instrument. The sound of the machine filled the air with its mighty roar, reminding Thelma of her mother cleaning house. The nurse stuck the wand into Thelma's throat. A thick black and green substance worked its way up the tube. A blob of slimy mucus that smelled horrendous and turned Thelma's stomach. She struggled not to squirm, feeling uncomfortable as the plastic sucked at her throat. Sometimes it caught at the back of her throat, pulling at the tissue of her esophagus. When the machine cleared away the moisture, Thelma eagerly sucked in as much air as she could, feeling a rush as the oxygen flooded into her system. Though she only had a hole in her throat to breathe through, she used her diaphragm to good effect. All the years her mother had forced her to go through yoga had paid off in one way, if not the intended one. The orderly from before came in, tossing a snap-button dress onto the bed. The colors were all wrong. She wanted blues and greens, since the home team was playing later today. This was a floral pattern, full of purples and reds. Her father may not be able to come visit her anymore, but she expected to wear her team's colors for the game. She started to throw a silent fit, tossing the dress out into the hall, and walked to the wall, pointing to her spelling board. She used her finger to spell out her message, making sure her anger carried through her motions. "Blue and green. It's game day." "I'm sorry, Thelma, but they're all down at the laundry, and we just don't have them on the ward. If you want, we can give you a pair of sweatpants and a sweatshirt." The man stepped outside, grabbing the dress and setting it back on the bed. She stabbed at the ground angrily, stamping her feet before charging across the room and picking it up. She tossed it out the door again, then sat on the bed, crossing her arms in silent defiance. "This is all I have for you to wear, hon. You have clothes in your closet. If you want to wear something else, you can wear one of those." He was smiling, seeming to be genuinely happy to her eyes. She glared at him, thinking he was making fun of her, and reached for the shoe on the ground next to her bed. He crossed his arms, and his eyes became hard and cold. "If you throw that at me, I'm taking it away. I don't like it when people throw things at me." That just made her angrier, and she threw the shoe to the floor in disgust. It bounced across the linoleum, skittering into her closet before it came to a stop. "Get dressed or don't. Doesn't matter to me, Thelma. But you need to have clothes on before you come out for the game." He reached outside the door, picking up the dress and throwing the dress onto the bed before closing it behind him. She couldn't resist it any longer. Thelma dropped her head into her hands and started to cry.
listening to Big World Network.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.